The war did not truly change when missiles crossed another border. It changed when energy became the target. For years, the world has treated the Gulf as both a lifeline and a vulnerability, a region whose stability underwrites everything from electricity in European homes to factory output in Asia and fuel prices in American suburbs. That fragile arrangement depended on one quiet assumption. Even in moments of confrontation, the infrastructure that keeps the global economy alive would remain largely off-limits. That assumption is now breaking apart in real time. What began as a military confrontation between Israel, Iran, and eventually the United States has entered a far more dangerous phase, one that moves beyond battlefield calculations and into the arteries of the world economy. The strike on South Pars, the world's largest gas field, was not simply another escalation in a brutal regional war. It was a signal that the boundaries are gone. And when Iran responded by striking energy facilities in neighboring Gulf states, including Qatar, the message became impossible to ignore. This conflict is no longer contained by geography, by military logic, or by the old rules of deterrence. It is becoming a war over systems, supplies, shipping lanes, and the economic foundations of global order. That is why markets reacted with such violence. Oil surged, natural gas prices leapt, stocks dropped across the United States and Europe, gasoline prices in America climbed sharply, pushing toward levels that immediately reshape consumer psychology and political pressure. The price shocks were not merely emotional overreactions to headlines. They were rational recognition that once gas fields, LNG terminals, refineries, and the Strait of Hormuz become active theaters of war, the consequences are no longer regional. They are planetary. At the center of this new reality is South Pars, a field so vast that it defies ordinary geopolitical language. It is not just a strategic asset. It is one of the pillars of modern energy flows. Shared by Iran and Qatar, it sustains domestic needs, export contracts, industrial planning, and state finances across the region. An attack on such a field is not symbolic. It is structural. It threatens years of production capacity, billions in revenue, and the credibility of long-term supply guarantees that entire economies depend on. The implications became even clearer when Qatar Energy's leadership described the damage in stark terms. A major portion of Qatar's liquefied natural gas export capacity has been knocked offline, with repairs expected to take years, not weeks. This is the kind of damage energy markets fear most. Oil can sometimes be rerouted, tankers can be redirected, strategic reserves can be tapped. But LNG systems are far less forgiving. They depend on complex, highly specialized infrastructure. Once those trains are damaged, the clock that matters is not counted in days. It is counted in seasons, contracts, and investment cycles. And that is what makes this moment so dangerous. The world is not simply witnessing another Middle Eastern crisis. It is watching the conversion of military escalation into long-duration economic disruption. Europe, already acutely sensitive to supply instability, now faces the prospect of further price shocks and inflationary pressure. Asian importers, particularly those tied to Qatari LNG, face mounting uncertainty. Governments that thought they were managing a regional war are now confronting the possibility of a rolling energy emergency. President Donald Trump's response captured both the volatility of the moment and the contradictions inside the American position. His threat was extraordinary even by the standards of crisis rhetoric. He warned that if Iran attacks Qatar again, the United States would massively blow up the entirety of South Pars. In one sentence, he attempted to restore deterrence through overwhelming menace, while also deepening the logic of total escalation. The message was intended to freeze the battlefield, but it also acknowledged, perhaps unintentionally, how central this gas field has become to the war's next phase. Once a president publicly frames the destruction of the world's largest gas field as an available option, the strategic imagination of every actor in the region shifts. Trump also insisted the United States knew nothing about the earlier Israeli attack on South Pars. That denial, however, is contested by reporting and by figures close to Qatari leadership. That dispute matters because it speaks to one of the most destabilizing elements of the conflict. Trust is collapsing not only between enemies, but among partners. Qatar, according to a senior official close to its leaders, is furious, not just at Iran, but at Washington and Israel as well. For Doha, the outrage is not theoretical. The kingdom sees itself as being burned in a war that is supposedly about preserving energy security, while its own energy infrastructure is now literally on fire. That anger reveals a broader truth. America's Gulf partners are being forced into an increasingly intolerable position. They rely on U.S. security guarantees, but they are now exposed to retaliation because of an American-backed or American-aligned war strategy they may not fully control. Their infrastructure is vulnerable, their domestic populations are anxious, and their economic role in the world has suddenly made them frontline targets. As one Gulf diplomat after another has suggested, the old assumption that these states could remain insulated while great powers and ideological rivals settle scores around them is rapidly evaporating. The Strait of Hormuz now sits at the center of that unraveling. For decades, it has been described as a choke point. That phrase can sound abstract until ships stop moving, insurance costs spike, seafarers become trapped, and entire economies begin pricing in scarcity. The Strait is not just a map feature. It is the narrow hinge on which a fifth of the world's oil shipments swing. Iran's actions there, combined with attacks on shipping and missile positions along the coast, have turned the Strait from a strategic bargaining chip into an active zone of economic coercion. European leaders, long reluctant to be drawn directly into a U.S.-led confrontation, are now signaling readiness to support efforts to reopen shipping. That shift is significant. It shows how energy shock can accomplish what diplomacy could not. European governments may disagree with Washington's choices, may resent the escalation, and may fear the inflationary consequences at home, but they also understand that a prolonged closure or even partial paralysis of Hormuz would force their hand. The same goes for Japan, whose prime minister faces a politically treacherous balancing act. Tokyo depends heavily on Gulf energy, yet the public has little appetite for deeper entanglement in a widening war. This is the strategic bind of every major importer: remain cautious and risk economic pain, or become more involved and risk military escalation. Meanwhile, Washington is reaching for emergency economic levers. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has floated the possibility of easing sanctions on Iranian oil stranded on tankers, an extraordinary idea that reflects just how severe the supply pressure has become. The logic is almost surreal. Use Iranian barrels against Iran, temporarily softening restrictions on the very commodity tied to the adversary in order to keep global prices from spiraling further. The administration has also moved to ease sanctions on Venezuelan oil and adjust shipping regulations. These are not the actions of a government confident that markets will absorb the shock. They are the moves of an administration trying to build an emergency bridge across a widening gap between war aims and economic reality. And yet, even as Washington improvises economically, the military picture grows darker. A U.S. F-35 was forced into an emergency landing after suspected enemy fire during a mission over Iran. On the surface, the aircraft landed safely, and the pilot survived. But strategically, the incident matters far beyond the damage report. The F-35 is not just another fighter jet. It is one of the most advanced symbols of U.S. air power and technological dominance. Even the suggestion that Iranian defenses may have struck or seriously damaged such an aircraft carries psychological weight. It tells regional audiences that Iran is not simply absorbing punishment. It retains the capacity to contest airspace, impose risk, and puncture the aura of total American control. That aligns with what U.S. military officials are themselves acknowledging. Iran, though badly degraded, still retains some military capability. It still has missiles, it still has drones, it still has the ability to project disruption across the Gulf. And perhaps most importantly, it still has the ability to impose uncertainty. In war, uncertainty can be as strategically potent as strength. It forces planners to widen contingencies, harden deployments, and accept that even technologically superior forces cannot reduce the conflict to a one-sided campaign. At the Pentagon, officials project confidence. They say the United States is winning. They describe thousands of targets struck, deeper penetrations into Iranian territory, the destruction of attack craft, mine layers, and missile storage facilities. They promise that the campaign is intensifying and that the largest strike packages are still to come. The language is decisive, uncompromising, and meant to reassure domestic audiences that there is a coherent path to victory. But beneath that confidence lies a fundamental strategic question. What does victory mean in a war like this? Is it the destruction of missile launchers, the reduction of naval capacity, the neutralization of the IRGC's mine-laying forces? Those may be operational goals, but they do not answer the larger political problem, because this war is already expanding beyond the metrics of battlefield success. If energy prices remain elevated, if Hormuz stays unstable, if Gulf infrastructure remains vulnerable, if Iran's leadership uses funerals and public anger to regenerate domestic mobilization, then tactical victories may coexist with strategic drift. That is the danger John Bolton, despite his very different politics, is indirectly pointing toward when he argues that the war cannot be considered a success if Iran's nuclear material remains unsecured. His warning is not merely about proliferation. It is about incompleteness. A campaign can destroy visible assets and still fail if the most dangerous capacities remain hidden, buried, dispersed, or transferable. Securing enriched uranium would require a different kind of operation, more intrusive, more complex, potentially involving ground forces in some capacity. And that is precisely where the contradiction in American strategy becomes most severe. Washington wants maximal outcomes without maximal commitment. It wants decisive degradation without occupation, control without entrapment, dominance without the costs historically required to impose it. Iran understands that contradiction. And like many weaker powers facing superior militaries, it appears to be leaning into asymmetric leverage. It may not be able to defeat the United States conventionally, but it does not need to. It only needs to make the cost of sustained conflict unbearable, unpredictable, and politically corrosive. That means threatening shipping. It means striking energy sites. It means demonstrating that every day of continued war brings a new shock to markets, alliances, and public patience. The human toll makes that strategy even more combustible. More than 2,000 people have been killed across the Middle East. In Iran, over 200 people have reportedly died from Israeli and American strikes. Lebanon has suffered hundreds more dead. Civilians in the West Bank have been killed by falling missile debris. In Israel, deaths continue to accumulate. American service members have also died, some in combat, others in the wider machinery of war. These numbers do not just measure tragedy, they shape the emotional architecture of escalation. Every funeral becomes a stage for anger. Every image of destroyed neighborhoods, wounded journalists, grieving families, and flag-draped coffins deepens the political pressure for retaliation. That emotional transformation is now visible inside Iran itself. Mass funerals for senior officials have become moments of public mobilization, with mourners voicing direct threats not only against Israel, but against Trump personally. Such scenes matter because they show that external military pressure does not automatically produce internal collapse. Sometimes it does the opposite. It fuses grief, nationalism, humiliation, and vengeance into a harder political will. Even regimes under immense strain can derive renewed legitimacy from national trauma, especially when framed as resistance to foreign attack. China's position reflects another layer of the geopolitical contest. Beijing has criticized Israel's killing of Iranian officials and called for an immediate ceasefire, while warning against pushing the region toward uncontrollable crisis. Publicly, this is the language of restraint. Strategically, it also allows China to present itself as the advocate of stability, while the United States appears identified with widening disruption. At the same time, Beijing is opportunistic. Its suggestion that Taiwan could enjoy energy stability under reunification is a reminder that global crises rarely stay within their original borders. Great powers use them to test narratives, apply pressure. Our Wang Gerti And Darty reframe unrelated disputes in their own favor. Russia, too, enters the picture through another channel: information, symbolism, and diplomatic tension. The reported injury of a journalist working for Russian state media in Lebanon adds another volatile layer to an already crowded battlefield. When wars widen, the number of actors with reasons to intervene rhetorically, diplomatically, or indirectly grows. The battlefield becomes not just a military contest, but a competition of narratives, legitimacy, and strategic positioning. Back in Washington, the domestic consequences are becoming harder to hide. Gas prices have surged nationwide, nearly reaching $4 a gallon on average. In many states, the rise has been far steeper than consumers can easily absorb. This is where geopolitics becomes painfully local. A missile strike in the Gulf becomes a family budget crisis in Arizona, Kentucky, Utah, New Jersey, or New York. The Federal Reserve, already navigating uncertainty, now faces the inflationary effects of an energy shock layered on top of war anxiety. Markets are not simply watching the war. They are trying to price the possibility that the conflict reshapes the economic outlook for months to come. Trump, for his part, has said he expected the economic impact to be worse. That remark is revealing. It suggests not calm confidence, but a gamble, a calculation that the strategic gains of attacking Iran would outweigh the economic backlash, or at least that the backlash could be managed. But wars do not obey the neat arithmetic of political timing. They mutate. They produce second-order effects. And when one of those effects is a confrontation around the world's largest gas field and the closure of one of the planet's most important shipping choke points, the margin for miscalculation shrinks rapidly. The reported Pentagon funding request of $200 billion underscores that reality. Even if framed as a broader military necessity, the scale of the number tells its own story. This is not a short, punitive operation. It is the financial language of sustained conflict, contingency planning, replenishment, and preparation for scenarios that may not yet be publicly acknowledged. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's blunt declaration that it takes money to kill bad guys may satisfy a certain political audience, but it also reflects how quickly the war is hardening into an open-ended enterprise. Even within the U.S. government, cracks in coherence are visible. Tulsi Gabbard has acknowledged that American and Israeli war objectives differ. Israel appears focused on decapitating Iranian leadership and targeting the regime at its core. Trump's stated objectives center more on degrading missile capabilities, production capacity, and naval threats. This divergence matters enormously. Alliances can survive tactical disagreement, but wars become strategically unstable when partners operate on overlapping battlefields with different desired endpoints. One side may see escalation as a path to regime collapse. The other may see it as a tool of coercive containment. Those are not the same war, even if they are fought against the same adversary. That divergence may also explain why the conflict keeps spilling into new domains. If Israel is willing to strike something as consequential as South Pars, it is operating according to a logic broader than narrow military suppression. It's targeting what underpins Iranian resilience: state capacity, economic durability, strategic leverage. But once that threshold is crossed, Iran's retaliation is almost guaranteed to target equivalent vulnerabilities among its rivals and their partners. The result is mirror escalation. Each side attacks what the other cannot easily replace. Each strike invites another. Each response expands the map. And then there is the leak investigation into Joe Kent, a former senior intelligence official who reportedly resigned in protest over the war and is now under FBI investigation for allegedly leaking classified information. On its face, this is a separate story. In reality, it reflects what prolonged war often does to governments. It generates dissent, bureaucratic fracture, moral protest, and suspicion. When wars are contested internally, information itself becomes a battlefield. Leaks emerge not only from opportunism, but from struggle over the direction, legality, or wisdom of the conflict. The wider region is reacting with alarm. The United Arab Emirates has condemned the strike on Qatar's industrial city as a terrorist attack and a direct threat to global energy security. Saudi officials say trust in Iran is shattered and hint that their own capabilities should not be underestimated. France's Emmanuel Macron calls the escalation reckless and urges a truce, especially as Ramadan nears its end. European leaders condemn the economic consequences while stopping short of full alignment with Washington's demands. Across capitals, the pattern is consistent: fear of escalation, anger at the damage, and recognition that the conflict may force choices they were desperate to avoid. What makes this war especially dangerous is that every actor is both constrained and tempted. Iran is constrained by superior force, but tempted to widen the economic pain. The United States is constrained by politics, costs, and alliance management, but tempted to escalate to restore deterrence. Gulf states are constrained by vulnerability, but tempted to respond more directly if attacks continue. Europe and Asia are constrained by dependence, but tempted to support maritime security operations if the energy shock worsens. Each player still believes it can avoid the worst while shaping the outcome. That belief is often how regional wars become systemic crises. The UN proposal for a safety corridor to evacuate stranded seafarers may appear humanitarian and technical, but it is also a warning. Roughly 20,000 seafarers are stuck aboard ships in the Gulf, exposed to the stresses and risks of a conflict that has transformed civilian commerce into collateral danger. When merchant crews become trapped in a war zone, the world is no longer dealing with an abstract energy scare. It is dealing with the breakdown of the basic protections that separate commerce from combat. And all of this is happening while the war remains unresolved at its core. Iran still has some military capability. The U.S. is striking deeper into Iranian territory. Israel continues operations across multiple fronts. Lebanon remains under pressure. Civilian casualties keep mounting. Markets remain volatile. Political rhetoric grows harsher. None of the underlying drivers, nuclear fears, deterrence failure, alliance tensions, regime survival, maritime control, energy leverage, have been stabilized. They are intensifying together. This is what makes the present moment feel so historically consequential. The Middle East has seen many wars. The world has endured many oil shocks. But occasionally, a conflict emerges that fuses military escalation with energy, insecurity, alliance strain, domestic political pressure, and great power competition all at once. Those moments are rare because they are so dangerous. They test not only armies, but systems, not only leaders, but the assumptions their governments have depended on for decades. The question now is not simply whether the next strike will come. It almost certainly will. The deeper question is whether any side still has a credible off-ramp that does not look like defeat. Iran cannot easily step back after senior officials, infrastructure, and civilians have been hit. Israel cannot easily step back if it believes pressure is working. Trump cannot easily step back after publicly escalating his threats and aligning American credibility with the campaign. Gulf states cannot simply absorb repeated attacks on their infrastructure without reconsidering their posture. And outside powers cannot indefinitely pretend that a war destabilizing Hormuz and LNG exports is someone else's problem. That is why this conflict may be remembered less for the first bombs dropped than for the moment energy became the battlefield. Once that happened, the war ceased to be about one country's nuclear ambitions or another's deterrence calculus alone. It became about the architecture of globalization itself, the routes ships take, the contracts utilities sign, the assumptions traders make, the alliances governments rely on, and the margin of safety civilians imagine exists between distant wars and their everyday lives. That margin is collapsing. What comes next may depend on whether the actors involved still recognize the scale of what they are risking. Destroying a missile site is one thing. Destroying the world's confidence in the stability of the Gulf is another. Military power can break targets. It cannot easily rebuild trust, reopen damaged LNG trains, calm futures markets, restore alliance confidence, or erase the memory of watching one of the most important energy regions on Earth slide towards systemic war. And perhaps that is the real meaning of this moment, not simply that the war has grown larger, but that it has become harder to measure. The damage is no longer confined to military inventories or casualty counts. It is accumulating in premiums, delays, inflation, diplomatic anger, public fear, and the creeping realization that the old guardrails may not hold. Once leaders begin threatening to annihilate gas fields, once advanced stealth aircraft are forced down under fire, Once seafarers wait helplessly in a combat zone, and once entire governments scramble to find replacement barrels and emergency policies, the crisis has already moved beyond the familiar. The war is now asking a brutal question of the international system. Can the world still contain a regional conflict once the infrastructure of global energy becomes a target? Right now, the answer looks less certain with every passing hour.